Hi everyone. I was sitting at the dining table, sipping my coffee when Kathy sat down across from me, with an unusual expression on her face. I could tell something was coming, but I had no idea what it would be. Taking a deep breath, she said, "I have been having an affair with my boss, Alex." The words were blunt, without the hesitations or stammering he might have expected from someone making such a confession. She didn't seem apologetic or even guilty. Instead, she explained it as though it were a choice he simply needed to accept. "I will make sure that you get your share of physical intimacy," she promised as if it were some kind of consolation prize. "I'll make sure you're not left out, Ben, but you need to understand." I felt a mix of disbelief and insult building in my chest. There was an absurdity to it that nearly made me laugh, but I held it back and looked her in the eyes. This woman I had been married to for 3 years was sitting across from me, calmly suggesting that we continue our marriage while she maintained an open affair. I wondered if I had ever truly known her. After a moment of silence, I couldn't hold back anymore. A short, dry laugh escaped my lips and I shook my head. "Kathy, if you think I'm going to sit here and go along with this, you don't know me at all. You don't get to just throw your decisions at my face and expect that I'll accept your affair. I am not your doormat. You need to find yourself a divorce lawyer." She stared back at me, surprised by my response. Maybe she thought I would be passive, or maybe she thought I needed her enough to tolerate anything. But her expression changed as she realized I was serious. She hadn't expected me to be that blunt. As I pushed my chair back, ready to leave, Kathy's expression darkened. There was something menacing in her eyes, a sharpness I'd never seen before. She leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "Ben, sit down. You don't get to just walk out on this conversation." I stopped and looked at her. She met my gaze, her lips curving into a cold, almost smug smile. "You think you can just leave, find a lawyer, and be done with me?" She said, "No, Ben, that's not how this is going to work." I stared at her. "Really? You think your threats will work?" "It will," she said, leaning and even closer. "If you try to walk away from me like this, I will ruin you. Do you understand? I'll go to the police. I'll tell them you hit me, that you threatened me." Her words were calm, almost casual. "They'll believe me. Ben, who do you think they'll trust? A well-respected attorney? Or some accountant nobody's ever heard of?" She tilted her head, watching me. "You think you'll just pick up and move on? But I'll make sure you have nothing left. I'll make sure you're begging to come back." I couldn't believe this was the same person I'd married. It was like I was staring at a stranger, someone who didn't care about destroying everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built. She looked at me as though she already knew I'd given, as though she was certain I wouldn't dare to risk the nightmare she was threatening. "So here's how this is going to go," she continued. "You'll stay, you'll play along, and you'll keep your mouth shut, where I will take everything from you and burn it to the ground. Your choice, Ben." I was still reeling from Kathy's threat when she leaned back in her chair, almost as if she'd made up her mind about something. She crossed her arms, a smug look on her face. "Oh, and one more thing, Ben," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I think it's time you meet Alex. He's coming over tomorrow." I blanked, barely processing her words. "What, are you really that dumb? You heard me." She smiled, a twisted, mocking expression. "He wants to meet you, and I want you to be on your best behavior. Be a nice boy for me, Ben." The humiliation cut deep, but I stayed silent, waiting for her to finish. "I expect you to make him comfortable, offer him a drink, maybe even a snack," she continued, as if she were dictating some normal household errand. "Who knows? Maybe he'll even be nice to you." I clenched my fists under the table, the anger bubbling up, but I forced myself to hold my tongue. She was looking at me, daring me to push back, to say something, anything that would give her more power over me. "Do you think it is a good idea, Kathy? What makes you think you can pull this off?" I said with a calm voice. Kathy leaned in, her smile fading, replaced by a hardness I hadn't seen before. "Because I can, Ben. Because this is my life, and I'll do what I want. And if you want to keep a shred of dignity, you'll do exactly as I say. I'll see you and Alex here tomorrow, and you'd better make a good impression, Kathy. Have you heard of Newton's laws of physics? For every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. However, with me the action might be something that you may not like. Rest, it's your call. This is the last suggestion that I will give you. Talk to your lawyer. Don't make it messy. This marriage is over. Walk away while I still allow you to walk. Your threats will never work on me, because I have an alpha male in my life. You are nothing. With that, she got up and left the room, leaving me there alone. It was clear. This wasn't a marriage anymore. It was a battlefield, and now I needed to hit back. The next evening, I was sitting alone in the living room, nursing a glass of Jack Daniels, trying to steel myself for the absurdity that was about to unfold. I heard the front door open, Kathy's voice full of forced cheer as she greeted him. I took a long sip, watching as she led him into the room, her hand resting on his shoulder like he was some prize trophy. Then I got my first look at him. Alex was shorter than I'd imagined. Fat. I felt a laugh bubbling up in my chest, and before I could stop myself, it slipped out. The whole thing was so ridiculous I could hardly believe it. This was the so-called alpha that Kathy had thrown everything away for. I looked him up and down, shaking my head, the laugh turning into a scoff. He was just 5 feet tall and shorter than Kathy. This leprechaun, I said, pointing at him, barely able to keep the smirk off my face. This is the guy you call an alpha male, Kathy. He does not even need to dress for Halloween. He can just wear a green suit, and he will be a leprechaun. Kathy's smile wavered, a flash of irritation crossing her face, but she tried to hide it. Watch your mouth, Bin, she snapped, her voice low and cold. Alex is everything you're not. Confident, assertive, a real alpha man. Oh really? I said, leaning back and taking another sip of my drink, feeling a rush of defiance. If this is what you think an alpha looks like, Kathy, maybe I was giving you way too much credit. Alex looked at me, glancing at Kathy as if he was looking for some kind of cue. I could see he didn't expect me laughing at him. It was hard not to find the whole scene a little comedic. Tell me, Alex, I said, unable to resist. How does it feel to come here into my home and play house with my wife? His face reddened, his attempt at bravado crumbling, and he shot another uncertain look. Kathy. Enough, Bin. Kathy hissed, her eyes blazing. I told you to be respectful, respectful. I said, letting out a humorless chuckle. I'm supposed to be respectful. You bring this hobbit in here, throw him in my face, and expect me to roll over and play nice. I could see her seething, but it didn't matter. Alex's face turned red as he tried to regain his composure, but his voice was dripping with anger. Listen, Bin, he said, his tone sharp and cocky. You think you're going to just walk away from this? I don't think so. Kathy and I have talked it over, and we'll make sure you end up with nothing. In the divorce, I'll make sure she takes everything. Straight down to the shirt on your back, he took a step closer, a smug smile forming on his face. And by the way, after we're done here tonight, I'll be sleeping with her in your bed. I held my ground, meeting his gaze without a hint of intimidation. Really, Alex, you think you can just waltz in here, throw around a few threats, and walk away with my life? Trust me, he said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. We'll take the house, the car, your job's income, everything, and we'll make sure you regret ever standing up to her. I raised an eyebrow. The house? I asked, barely able to contain my laughter. That house isn't even mine. Alex, it belonged to my mother. I just live here. You won't get a penny from it. Alex's face faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, shifting to his next weapon. Fine, but we'll still take your job's income. Kathy deserves it, and I'll make sure you're paying her for the rest of your life. I couldn't help but smirk, taking another slow sip of my drink. Sorry to disappoint you, Alex, but I already resigned from my job. What? Alex's smug expression finally cracked, his eyes darting to Kathy as if she'd somehow betrayed him. He looked completely blindsided. That's right, I continued, feeling a surge of satisfaction. So no assets, no job, no income for you to leech off. I guess that little plan of yours isn't quite as airtight as you thought. Kathy glared at me, clearly caught off guard and furious, while Alex stood there, struggling to process the situation. I could see the gears turning in his head, realizing that the payday he'd counted on was slipping away. I looked between the two of them, finally feeling in control of my own life again. "So, Alex," I said, my tone calm but pointed, "why don't you rethink exactly what it is you think you're taking from me? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you're the one who's got nothing." Alex's face twisted with a smug grin as he leaned in closer, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You're not in charge here, Ben," he said, practically taunting me. "I'm the alpha now, and you'll do what you're told. In fact, I think I'll take Kathy upstairs to your bed. Right now, there's nothing you can do about it." I set my glass down slowly, my blood boiling as I looked him dead in the eyes. "Alex," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I'm warning you, get out of my house right now." But instead of backing down, he laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. And before I could react, he slapped me across the face. Hard, the slap stung. But the fury it ignited inside me was something else entirely. He straightened up, looking at me with a smirk, clearly enjoying himself. "You really think you can stand up to me?" he sneered. "Guys like you are just all air and no substance. I'm the real deal and I can destroy you, Ben. You're nothing. You're not like me or in control, and I'll make sure you rot in jail if you try anything. You'll be begging for mercy by the time I'm done with you." The slap stung, but it gave me a smile. Ben felt the slap sting his cheek, and something in him snapped. All the humiliation, the rage, the months of disrespect, they boiled over, breaking through the restraint he tried to hold on to. He stood up from his chair, his fists clenched, his voice low and steady. "You think you're the real deal, Alex?" Ben's fist connected with Alex's jaw, and he went stumbling back, barely able to react, before Ben hit him again, then again. With every punch, Ben let out the words he'd been holding back. "You think you're the real deal, Alex?" he said, a dark determination settling over him. "Real men don't try to tear apart other people's lives. Real men don't walk into another man's home and act like they own it, and they don't ruin marriages for their own ego. You're nothing, Alex. Real men protect their families." Another punch landed squarely on Alex's ribs, and Ben heard a satisfying crack. "Real men have integrity." Alex was gasping now, trying to put his hands up in defense, but Ben didn't stop. Each punch was a release. Each hit an exorcism of the anger that had been building for so long. Finally, Ben picked Alex up in his hands, looked him in the eyes and said, "I am no alpha. Or a beta. I am the man." With that, he hoisted Ben over his head and slammed him down on the floor. Alex was crumpled on the floor, bruised and beaten. Ben took a step back, breathing hard, his chest heaving as he looked down at the man who had thought he could come into his life and tear it apart. Kathy stood frozen for a moment, her eyes wide with disbelief as she watched Alex crumble to the ground, bloodied and bruised. Her hands trembled, rage and fear mixing inside her. Without thinking, she rushed at Ben, her fists flying, pounding uselessly against his back in a desperate attempt to make him stop. But before she could land another punch, a woman's firm grip seized her wrists, yanking her backward. Kathy let out a startled scream as she was pulled off balance, spinning around to face her attacker. The woman holding her was tall, with short cropped hair and an intense, unwavering gaze. Her grip was unrelenting, like iron around Kathy's wrists. She tried to struggle, but the woman was too strong. Her movements calculated, swift and controlled. "Let me go," Kathy screamed, jerking her arms, but the woman's hold tightened. "No," the woman, Linda, said, her voice low and commanding, "You're done." With an almost terrifying ease, Linda twisted Kathy's arms behind her, forcing her to her knees. Kathy gasped, unable to fight back as Linda used her body's weight to slam Kathy down, onto the floor beside Alex. Linda wasn't done yet, though. She stepped back, assessing Kathy for a moment, and then, with savage precision, she began, delivering a series of brutal blows. Her fists came down with unyielding force, landing against Kathy's chest and stomach. Her strikes a mixture of speed and power that only someone trained in hand-to-hand combat could deliver. Each punch knocked the wind out of Kathy, and she could barely gasp for breath between the hits. Kathy tried to shield herself, but it was useless. Linda moved like a storm, relentless and unstoppable. The former Marine was no stranger to fighting, and she showed it as she hammered into Kathy. Ben, still catching his breath, stood there for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. He turned to Linda, her stance strong, calm and confident, as if she had just neutralized a threat with ease. "I don't think she's going to be causing you any more problems," Linda said with a grim satisfaction, watching as Kathy lay there, gasping for breath. "She's learned the hard way what happens when you mess with the wrong people." Ben thanked Linda for staying hidden during the confrontation and helping him out with Kathy, as he could never raise his hand on a woman. The police and medics arrived shortly after Linda had finished with Kathy and Alex. There, sirens wailing in the distance as they rushed into the house. Ben stood in the corner, trying to steady himself, watching as they took control of the scene. Alex was barely conscious, his face swollen and bloodied, while Kathy was sitting up, her eyes wide with a mix of rage and fear. Both of them were swiftly loaded into ambulances and carted off to the hospital, where the real fallout would begin. Once they arrived, the officers continued their questioning. Alex, still groggy from the beating, attempted to assert himself, despite the pain. He was sitting up on a hospital bed, his voice shaking but filled with defiance. "I want to file a complaint against Ben," Alex demanded, trying to muster what little bravado he had left. "He attacked me in cold blood, and I want charges pressed." The officer, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense look, flipped his notebook closed with a slow, deliberate motion, his gaze never leaving Alex. "You sure about that?" the cop asked, his voice low, his tone suddenly colder than it had been. "You realize who you're talking about, right?" Alex, trying to regain some control of the situation, looked confused. "What are you talking about?" The officer leaned in, lowering his voice as he spoke. "Ben's a former biker associated with a pretty notorious biker gang, the kind of people you don't want to mess with. If you file that complaint, you won't just be dealing with him. You'll be dealing with all of them." Alex's bravado began to crack, his eyes widened, and his throat tightened as the realization hit him. The cop didn't stop there. "This beating," the officer continued, a hard edge to his words, "it'd be a cakewalk compared to what might come your way if you make this a police matter. Are you man enough to take on all of them? Because I can guarantee you, if you push this, it's not just going to be Ben knocking on your door." Alex gulped, his hands shaking now. He glanced over at the officer, then backed down at his own bruised and battered body. The image of Ben's fists, the way they had hammered him into submission, was still fresh in his mind. But now, the idea of dealing with an entire gang of bikers, people who probably had no problem taking things further than just a few punches, left him terrified. Alex's face paled. His eyes darted around the room as if looking for an escape. But there was none. He couldn't stop thinking about what the officer had just said. Ben and his gang weren't people to be taken lightly. "No," Alex muttered, his voice trembling. "No, I won't file anything. Forget I said anything." His bravado had evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. The officer nodded, closing his notebook with a snap and standing up. "Good choice. I'd advise you to keep your distance from Ben and from anyone connected to him. You wouldn't want to end up regretting this further." Alex didn't respond. His mind was already racing, the fear of what might come next flooding his thoughts. He had no idea what he'd gotten himself into, but one thing was certain: this was far from over, and he wasn't ready to face the consequences of angering someone like Ben. Or worse, his associates. Kathy stood outside the hospital room, her face bruised but mostly intact, a deep anger still simmering inside her. She was determined to confront Alex and make sure they both stuck to the plan. She had been humiliated and beaten, but she wasn't going to let Ben get away with it. She would file for divorce, destroy him and leave him with nothing. That was the plan, at least. She walked into Alex's room, her steps purposeful. He was sitting on the bed, his face a mess of cuts and swelling, and his eyes were sharp. When he saw Kathy, he looked up at her, clearly still shaken from the beating he had taken. Earlier, Kathy was ready to lash out, to demand that they stay strong and finish what they had started. But as soon as she stepped inside, Alex's reaction was not what she expected. "Leave me alone, Kathy," Alex said, his voice hoarse. "I don't want anything to do with this anymore. I value my life. You've really gotten us into something we should have never been part of. This is bigger than I thought." He stared at him, stunned. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, stepping closer. "We can still make this work. I'll divorce him, take everything." "No." Alex cut her off, his eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand. If you value your life, you need to drop everything. Leave Ben and get out of town." Now Kathy blinked in confusion. "What are you saying? What do you mean? Leave him?" Alex swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably on the bed. He hesitated for a long moment before finally speaking again, his voice trembling. "Ben isn't just some guy you can divorce and walk away from. He's connected. He was part of a biker gang, a really dangerous one. I don't know all the details, but I know enough. People like him don't just let things go. If you go after him, if you try to take anything from him, he'll come after you, Kathy. And trust me, it won't be a slap across the face. It'll be worse." Kathy's heart started to race. She'd known Ben had a rough past, but she had always assumed it was just that, a past. She had no idea just how dangerous his past really was. Alex was shaking now, the fear in his eyes palpable. "Ben's not just a regular guy, Kathy. I was stupid to think we could take him on. If you file for divorce and try to take anything from him, you'll be marked. You're dealing with a whole other level of danger. And it's not just Ben. You're gonna piss off the whole gang. You won't get away. They'll find you. They'll make your life hell. You need to leave. And you need to leave now. No divorce. No nothing. Just go." Kathy stood frozen, her thoughts racing. Alex's words felt like a slap in the face, but the fear in his eyes was real. This wasn't some idle threat. Ben's past was something far more dangerous than she had ever realized. She had always seemed Ben as weak, someone she could control. But now it was clear that she had underestimated him and his past. The man who had once seemed like the perfect victim was something far darker. Something she had never anticipated. "I didn't know," Kathy muttered almost to herself. Her mind was spinning. She had made so many plans for revenge, for taking everything from Ben. But now she wasn't sure she could follow through. What Alex was saying made too much sense. "Alex," Kathy said, her voice trembling. "What do I do now?" Alex's voice dropped to a whisper. "You do nothing. You walk away quietly. If you try to drag this out, if you try to take him down, you're not just fighting him. You're fighting everything he's connected to. And you'll lose. You need to leave him and leave now. Before it's too late." Kathy looked at him, her hands shaking. She was trapped in a nightmare she had created. The fear settled in deep, a cold, terrifying truth creeping over her. She wasn't the one in control anymore. And it was clear now. If she didn't listen to Alex, if she didn't just walk away and disappear, Ben's world was going to consume her whole. The atmosphere in town shifted in the days following Kathy's hasty decision. The sound of roaring engines filled the streets. 70 bikers, each on their massive machines, patrolling with a steady, intimidating presence. Their thunderous engines reverberated through every corner of the town, a constant reminder of the power that lay behind Ben's past. It was as if the very air had thickened with tension. Kathy, her resolve broken and her mind clouded with fear, wasted no time. She met with Alex's lawyer, signed the divorce papers, and walked away with nothing. No assets, no custody. The settlement was a stark reminder of just how little control she had left over her own life. Alex had assured her it was for the best. But deep down, Kathy knew she was leaving town, not just to escape Ben, but to save whatever was left of her life. 5 days after signing the papers, Kathy was gone. She packed her things quickly, taking only what she could carry, and left without a word. To anyone in town, she disappeared as swiftly as she had come. Her name now just another whisper in the wind, but Alex was not as fortunate. Despite his earlier bravado, his encounter with Ben's world had only just begun. For the 7 days he spent in the hospital, recovering from his injuries, A constant presence lingered by his bedside. Every day, without fail, 2 bikers arrived during visiting hours. They never spoke to him. They never touched him. They didn't need to. They simply sat quietly. Their gaze is fixed on him, unwavering and cold. Every time he woke up, groggy and in pain, those 2 men were there silently watching. It wasn't just a warning. It was a message. Each visit was like a reminder that Alex had crossed a line and now he was at the mercy of forces far beyond his understanding. They didn't need to speak. Their presence alone was enough to keep him in a constant state of fear. The days dragged on, and Alex couldn't shake the feeling that he was being sized up, judged, not just for what he had done but for what he might do next. And every time he looked up at them, he realized there was nothing he could do. His fate had already been sealed, and it was no longer in his hands after 7 days, when Alex was finally discharged from the hospital, knowing that he had narrowly escaped, to fate far worse than anything he had ever imagined. He'd learned the hard way that not all battles were meant to be fought, and not all men could be intimidated. Some men had entire worlds behind them, worlds that didn't need to raise a finger to bring you to your knees. His trip from hospital to home was again a nightmare. 70 bikes escorted him. Alex's life after his release from the hospital was a slow unraveling. At first, he tried to go about his normal routine, but everywhere he went, he couldn't escape the ever-present eyes of the bikers. They were always there, lurking in the background at the gas station, on street corners, in the shadows of alleyways. No matter how fast or far he tried to run, they were always one step behind, watching, waiting. First, he thought it was a coincidence. Maybe it was just paranoia, a product of the brutal beatdown he had endured. But as the days passed, the reality set in. They weren't just following him, they were making sure he couldn't escape. Wherever he went, wherever he tried to hide, there they were 2 or 3 of them, always just within his sight. Silent, unmoving, watching him like predators waiting for the moment to strike. Alex tried to summon the courage to do something about it. He thought about going to the police. He had an entire story to tell about Kathy, about Ben, about the threats, the gang, the constant surveillance. But every time he tried to take action, something stopped him. He was the sight of the bikers that paralyzed him with fear, that deep, gnawing anxiety in his gut. He couldn't shake the feeling that, even if he went to the cops, it would do no good. They were everywhere. Then, one day, just as Alex was heading to the local police station, something stopped him cold. He was walking down the sidewalk when he spotted a familiar figure across the street, none other than the town's police chief. But what caught Alex off guard wasn't just seeing him, it was the leather biker jacket the chief was wearing. The very same one that the bikers wore, the one with the unmistakable patch. Alex's heart dropped into his stomach. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just a local gang. This was their town. The bikers weren't just some rogue group of criminals. They were embedded in the very fabric of the community, with their reach extending into every corner, including the police force itself. He froze, staring at the police chief, whose face betrayed no emotion as he walked past. The chief didn't even glance at Alex. But the message was clear. There was no escaping this. The town was under the control of people who answered to a much darker force than Alex had ever realized. Alex's thoughts began to spiral. He could no longer ignore it. The bikers weren't just following him. They were controlling him, making sure he understood that there was no safe place, no way out. His every move was being watched, not just by the bikers, but by the very institution he had once believed would protect him. With no other options left, Alex knew what he had to do. He couldn't stay. He couldn't fight, not against Ben's world, not against the bikers who seemed to have infiltrated every part of town. He had no choice but to leave. That night. Now start next story. My name is Greg Johnson. I was married for 17 years to a woman who, as I thought, loved me with all her heart, Caroline. So sue me, I am a cuckold. She has been having an affair with her boss for about 6 years now, who owns a real estate firm where she works. We have 3 children, a 16-year-old girl and a 12-year-old boy. The third one is a beautiful little girl who just turned 2. I love them all except for my wife. Oh yes, before I forget, I am a police sergeant. About 2 months ago, my youngest daughter fell at daycare, and my wife was unreachable to pick her up. Dad rushes to help. I jumped into my car with flashing lights and raced after her. She was sucking on a lollipop on a stick and sniffling. I approached her, inspected her, kissed her, and tousled her hair. The older ones wouldn't allow it, but she likes it. I left her giggling and went to talk to the principal. She told me that Gidget fell and hurt her leg pretty badly. They called for an ambulance and it will be here soon. I went and sat with my daughter, and soon she started laughing again. A doctor from the emergency service appeared and said she needed to go to the emergency room to get stitches. So, I escorted the ambulance to the emergency room. I tried to contact my wife, but the communication went to voicemail. I left a message and then launched the locator app because Linny constantly misplaced her smartphone. The phone was smart, not so much with my wife. It showed her at the Holiday Inn Hotel, just 7 miles away from here. I sat with my daughter while they stitched her up. When they finished, we signed some forms. I went to the trunk and got out a foldable child seat. I installed it in the back seat and strapped her in with the seatbelts. Then we went to find her mother. My stomach began to reject the lunch I had eaten. I pulled into the parking lot of the Holiday Inn and arrived just in time to see Caroline and Arthur Dash, her boss, exiting the lobby. They stood arm in arm, his left hand resting on her buttocks. They were laughing and smiling, and then she kissed him. You could almost think she was kissing me. It was precisely such a kiss. I parked the big Ford and watched, adjusting the camera to a tight focus as they made their way to her, Lincoln Aviator. She turned to him and licked his glands. His hand slipped. Yes, slipped. Under her skirt, lifting it enough for me to see the lace tops of her stockings. I had to beg her to wear stockings, and never in public. Then she slid her hand under the hem of her dress and pulled out her sky blue lace panties, which I had given her on our anniversary. She smiled, sniffed them, and handed them to him. Everything's over, I recalled my thoughts. They laughed, kissed again, and then she got into her car and drove off. Suddenly, I saw brake lights, and her car swerved to a stop. Her car was stationary, and suddenly my phone rang. I looked at the number and the name. It was that crap. Caroline, I answered evenly. What's happened? Where are you? She asked. I'm at the hospital. The baby is fine. Where are you? I couldn't reach your phone. I'm in the office. I'm on my way to the hospital now. Drive carefully, I said, hanging up. I watched her car as she called twice more. I switched them all to voicemail. She started moving forward and nearly collided with a pickup truck when she screamed and ran out onto the street. I sighed and headed home. I grabbed my phone, dialed a friend's number, and told him I needed to talk to him. I pulled up to the house and dragged sleeping Gidget inside. I went back to my car and picked up 4 DNA swab kits. I went in and swabbed Gidget's mouth with a tampon. I placed the tampon in the container, sealed it, and marked the plastic bag. I went for a cup of tea with ice and called work. I spoke to my boss, the head of the detective department, and told him I needed the remainder of the week off to attend to some family matters. Everything all right? He asked. Yes, sir. I just need to see one of the doctors regarding my children. All right. Just keep me posted. Got it, Chief. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. I felt physically sick when I saw her, but I took a deep breath and counted to 10. I only made it to 7 before she knocked on the door. Where is she? She screamed. I told her to calm down and that she was sleeping. She brushed past me into the baby's bedroom. I started making a list of things to do for tomorrow. Divorce lawyer, DNA test, electronics store. She came out of the bedroom and rushed to me. What happened? She demanded. She fell. Everything's fine with her. She handled it like a champ. Just 4 stitches, and the doctor said they'll hardly leave a scar. She's fine, Caroline. Why didn't they call me? She shouted at me. They tried, dear. They couldn't reach you. I tried too. The message went to voicemail. So where were you, dear? She started stuttering and looked away. I was at a meeting. I turned it off so it wouldn't interrupt the meeting. I suggest instead of turning it off, you put it on vibrate. I'm just glad nothing serious happened with the kids. Or maybe something fatal didn't happen to me. Her face clouded, then she paled. I never thought about that, she said. Course you didn't, dear. I thought to myself. With these words, 2 more of our children ran in from school. Marissa, who is 16, and Junior, who is 12. They stopped in the living room and looked at their parents. What happened, Dad? My son asked. My lovely daughter shot her mother a cold glance, but she asked me, is everything okay? Dad? She asked. Yes. Your sister fell at daycare and got a cut. She had to go to the emergency room to get stitches, and I went with her, I said, watching my wife. She flinched. Where were you, Mom? Marissa asked. I was at a meeting, she mumbled. Obviously, my daughter knew or suspected something. Junior, as we called him, stared at his mother intently. Really, Mom? He said. Caroline hesitated and blushed deeply. I need to take a shower, she said. Couldn't resist. Didn't you take it this morning? I innocently asked. She stumbled and looked at me, trying to provoke a spontaneous outburst from me. Deal with it, Craig? She hissed. She turned and stormed upstairs. I turned to my children and was surprised by their looks. They were devastated and looked sadly at me. Everything will be fine, guys. Just a little disagreement. Whatever you say, Dad, Marissa said. Junior just nodded. How about some pizza? I asked. I called and ordered pizza. 30 minutes later, they brought 2 large pizzas, one with pepperoni, one with mushrooms. The kids hollered, even little Gidget, and we waited for their mom. She showed up and turned up her nose. You know, I only like anchovies, she growled. So sue me, I said. She gave me a piercing glare and went to pour herself some wine. The kids chuckled and shot disapproving looks at their mother. She rushed off somewhere, and the kids and I recounted school events and community activities, that is, dates and the like. It was chilly between us that night, and I had to grab another blanket. It had been about 3 months since we were close. It would be even harder. The next day, I met with a lawyer and asked her what my options were. She still couldn't stand cheaters, especially women, and had a soft spot for cops. But she told me we were not at fault, and despite everything, they'd crucify me if my wife didn't agree to everything I wanted. She told me to gather all possible evidence, and we'll see what we'll see. She actually said that, from an alimony perspective, I was in decent shape because my wife earned more money than I did. Besides, due to her age, my elder daughter could decide for herself who she wanted to live with. I went to a friend and asked him to set up surveillance on my wife and her friend. He was a good friend, and I had worked with him before. It wouldn't cost too much, and I would have everything I needed. Then I went to an electronics store and bought several wireless voice recorders and 3 video cameras. I went home and installed cameras in the master bedroom, the living room, and the guest room. I would place one of the tape recorders in her car, one on the bookshelf in the living room, and another in the master bedroom. Then I received a message from my wife that she would be home late and that I should watch the kids until she got back. I got ready, went and picked up Gidget, and then went home to prepare dinner. About 2 hours later, my 2 older kids came home, and we discussed dinner. Grilled chicken, mashed potatoes, and creamed spinach. How does that sound? I asked. Marissa said it sounded appetizing. The youngest looked at me, smirked slightly, and asked, "What does Mom want?" I told him that Mom could cook her own dinner. Marissa and the youngest glanced at each other, and then Marissa said, "Dad, we need to talk." I figured I was going to be read the riot law, so we moved to the kitchen and started dinner. She began, "Dad, I think Mom's cheating. She doesn't respect you, and she's never around when we need her." Marissa's right, Dad. I was glad they had both looks and brains, wherever they got them from. I stopped what I was doing and gathered them into a group hug. Their youngest sister immediately joined us, shouting, "Me too, me too." I looked at my children and told them I loved them more than myself. I always told them that. They always thought it was corny, but they liked it. I told them things didn't look good, and I was keeping an eye on what their mother was up to. But know this, I'll always love you. You're my kids. We'll get through this, I promise. The youngest chirped, "I think you should get cheek swabs for us, Dad. It might help your case. It would never change how I feel about you, but it'd be nice to know how rotten she is." The youngest is right, Dad. I want to know because right now, I'm not feeling much love for her. I was stunned, but I felt sorry for them. All right, let's get this done before she gets home, I said. I took cheek swabs, theirs first, then mine. I sealed them up and put them in my briefcase. The next day, I went to an independent lab and asked them to run a DNA express analysis. Cost a little more, but I wanted it done as quickly as possible. 2 weeks later, I got the results. None of the children were mine. Her company always threw a 4th of July party at the owner's house. I really didn't want to go, but I was told I had to. She was one of the top wine salespeople in the company and was expected to be there. I had everything I needed on her and her lover. Tapes, photos, audio recordings, videos, receipts, and the DNA test results. I just couldn't think of a better way or time to do it. I realized that no matter what I did or when, I was going to lose. And I went. She said it wasn't going to be a family event, so the kids weren't invited. Looking back, I realized that was a blessing. We arrived just after 11 o'clock in the morning and grabbed a couple of drinks. Beer for me, white wine for her. She was dressed in a yellow sundress, no bra, 7 centimeters espadrilles, and a shawl. She looked good. I stayed fairly close to her, not exactly watching her, but still watching. Her friend found her and chatted with her for a bit. He whispered sweet nothings in her ear, then went back to playing the host. He disappeared, and I immediately intensified my surveillance of Carolyn. She kept looking around, and after the 3rd glass, she lost sight of me. She doesn't handle alcohol well and was 1 gulp away from getting drunk. I watched as she grabbed another glass of wine and slid to the back of the lawn lot his house was built on. 2 of her work friends tried to distract me, but I switched to Coke after half of my bud. They were slightly tipsy, and I managed to keep an eye on her as she headed towards the corner of the garden shed and disappeared behind the back door. I put my Coke on the table, took out my cell phone, and turned on the video camera. I moved towards the corner of the shed, sneaked around it, left the area, and made my way to the gate at the back of the building. I peeped around the corner and saw my wife. Her sundress was pulled up to her waist and her tits were exposed to the sun and the breeze. He had her and she was moaning and groaning the whole time. Her white lace panties were lying on the ground. A light bulb went on in my head and I thanked my lucky stars for this stroke of luck. I turned the camera off and took a few pictures. As soon as I pulled out my phone, I waited for them to climax. Then I reached for his stupid-looking man-ass, grabbed it, and pulled him out of my wife and off of her. I spun him around and punched him in the face with my right hand, shattering his nose and breaking his left cheekbone. I managed to break something in my hand as well. He slumped to the ground unconscious, and Carolyn slid down the shed wall and also sprawled out on the ground. I pulled out my handcuffs and cuffed him to the fence post while reading him his rights. You are under arrest for rape. You have the right to remain silent. If you choose to waive your right to remain silent, anything you say can be used against you in court. Carolyn began to scream. Craig, what are you doing? You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights as I have explained them to you? Carolyn was already hysterical and was struggling to get up. I took out my cell phone, dialed 911, and waited. 911, what's your emergency? This is Detective Craig Johnson, badge number 714. I'm at Larson Street, and I have a suspect in custody for rape. I need backup and a supervisor on the scene as soon as possible and an ambulance. Private residence, party in progress. Carolyn was furious. This isn't what you think. It's not rape, you idiot. Here's how it's going to go, Carolyn. This is rape. I have video, audio, pictures, photographs, tapes, receipts, timelines of where you've been, and the DNA of our 3 children showing that they're not mine. Are you going to agree to this, or will you never even look at your children again, you crap? Blood drained from her face. She collapsed to the ground again and screamed. No. I lifted her up and wrapped her in her shawl. Decide, Carolyn. She muttered, my panties. You didn't need them 5 minutes ago. Why do you think you need them now? Leave them at the crime scene for the guys. I helped her to her feet. She sobbed, breathed heavily, and sniffled. We made our way across the lawn behind the house to the backyard. As we approached, about 10 or so people loitering outside fell silent. more shocked than anything. They moved aside, and I led her to an empty lounge chair and sat her down. Two of her tipsy friends rushed over to her and started shouting. "What happened? What did you do to her?" "I didn't do anything. Your boss raped her." "What?" Donna screamed. "You heard me," I said. "You didn't know?" "You didn't know." Laura squealed. "Know what?" I asked. "She said she had an open marriage. She said you were fine with it." "She lied," I said. Just then, the cops arrived. I directed 2 officers downstairs to the garden shed and instructed them to read him his rights again because I wasn't sure he heard me. A replacement sergeant arrived with another patrol officer, and I ordered the officer to take statements from Donna and Laura and their addresses. The jerk's wife pushed her way through the crowd and wanted to know what was going on. The sergeant explained that her husband had been arrested for rape, and someone told her what happened. She exploded. "You crap." She lunged forward and tried to attack Caroline, who by this time was almost catatonic. The cops restrained her, and shortly after, paramedics arrived. I told them what had happened, and they put Caroline on a stretcher. When she got up, she left a small puddle on the lounge chair. His juice was running down her leg and she was crying. I told them to take her to a trauma center and get her checked for rape. Then 2 other cops brought Arthur with a swollen face and hands handcuffed behind his back. He made the mistake of saying they had an understanding and the intimacy was consensual. Unfortunately, his wife heard him and lunged at him. "You son of a bitch." They restrained her again, and she said, "You'll hear from my lawyer." I followed them to the station and signed all the forms because, after all, she was still my wife. I went to the precinct and filed a complaint against him under oath. Since it was Saturday, he couldn't be arraigned until Monday. He tried to reach his lawyer, but his wife had beaten him to it. I returned to the reception area and went to see my soon-to-be ex-wife. She had a rough day and looked terrible. She saw me come in, brightened up, and attempted to smile. Then she saw the expression on my face and became alarmed at my demeanor. "So, Caroline, how long has this been going on?" She trembled, and tears welled up in her eyes. "It wasn't supposed to last long. Just a little fling. I didn't mean for this." "Bullshit, Caroline." I lunged towards her and stopped a few inches from her face. "Gidget's not mine, Junior's not mine, and Marissa's not mine. It's been 17 years. We've been married for 17 years. You can do the math yourself, you crap. You're supposed to be one of the top sellers. Why, Caroline, why?" The tears were almost immediately replaced by a smirk as she wiped her eyes. "Because I can. You're supposed to be a detective, you figure it out. I can have as many lovers as I want and you have no idea." I looked at my soon-to-be ex-wife and something inside me died. I stared right through her and the cold expression on my face said a lot to her. It seemed like she aged centuries before my eyes, shrinking into herself. "Oh God, what's wrong with me?" I took her hand and led her to our car. I sat her in the passenger seat, got in myself, and drove to her parents' house. She stared blankly out the window until we pulled up to their house and stopped. "What are we doing here?" "I want to go home. People in hell want ice water, crap." I got out, pulled her from the car, and led her to the front door. I rang the bell, and when it opened, there stood her father. "Frank," I said, "your daughter needs to stay here for a while. I'll come back tomorrow to explain everything. She just got out of the emergency room. Please take care of her." He looked at me as if I had 2 heads. I turned and walked away. I turned off my phone and headed home. I went to my kids and they looked at me. "Where's Mom?" "She's at your grandparents'. She'll be there for a while." I briefed them on what had happened, sparing the gory details. They accepted it after tears and sniffles and said they understood why I did what I did, but they couldn't understand why she did what she did. Welcome to the club, I thought. I went and gathered reports, tapes, photos, surveillance reports, and receipts of everything I had on her. I prepared 4 packages in total, leaving out only the DNA test results. I called the lawyer and pulled the divorce trigger. I requested a restraining order based on the police report and the rape case materials. I enclosed the DNA results in a packet for the lawyers, then went to the asshole's house and talked to his wife, Lorna. I apologized for the disturbance, and she kindly sympathized with me about the overall mess. I handed her the packet I had and told her to use whatever she wanted. She was a little taken aback and thanked me. I left and went home. I stopped by her parents' house and gave one of the packages to my future ex-father-in-law. Your daughter is messed up. You need to get her some help. I turned and left. I went home. The next day, we went to church and then to Denny's for breakfast. I kept my phone off the entire day and night. On Monday morning, I showed up at work and got the time for the asshole's arraignment. I appeared at the courthouse and witnessed the arraignment. His lawyer played the consensual sex card and claimed there was no rape. They presented statements from 2 women from the company. The judge wasn't sure she liked what she heard, but said she was dismissing the charges with prejudice, meaning he could face new charges if anything changed. He turned, saw me, and smirked. That didn't last long, as whoever was his wife's advance man arranged for him to be served divorce papers on his way out of the courthouse. Along with the restraining order, I smirked as I left. Not quite even yet. I came home with copies of the rape report, the police report, and the DNA results from the rape scene. Guess who the biological father of my poor little daughter was? I was on the phone with my lawyer when someone knocked on my front door. Now, there's only one person I know who knocks instead of ringing the bell. Of course, I opened the door to my current brother-in-law. Anthony was Carolyn's older brother, but only by about 3 years. He had his own construction company. There were rumors he had ties to the mafia. A few years back, his son got into some trouble with drugs, and I pulled a few strings, 99% legal, and sorted it out. Then we got him into a program, got him straightened out, and now he's in his 3rd year at seminary doing well. Needless to say, I was his favorite brother-in-law. So, this was probably not a social call. Tony squeezed past me, greeted by my kids. They loved him, his wife Teresa, and their 3 kids. He broke free from their embrace, turned to me and said, "We walked to the back porch," and he turned to me and said, "What the hell is going on?" Carolyn is feeling unwell at her parents' house, and Dad is furious. Did she tell you anything? You kicked her out. Then she got evasive and didn't want to talk anymore. It was right after Dad showed her the literature you gave him. What's going on? Did you look into any of the things your dad had? He wouldn't let me. Sigh. Your sister has been cheating on me for 17 years. None of my kids are biologically mine. She spread her charms everywhere. I don't know who Marissa's or Junior's father is. She probably doesn't either. Gidget's father is her current boss, Arthur Dash. She also has a sexually transmitted disease, gonorrhea, and she's pregnant. Not by me. Your dad has everything I have except for the rape evidence and the police report. But my lawyer has it all. She'll be served divorce papers this week. He slumped into a chair and looked at me despondently. No chance? Of what, and would you have done it? No, I understand. They dropped the charges against the shithead, that's what I call him, and his wife left him, who also has everything your dad has, thanks to me. I didn't want to be harsh to your parents, Tony, but with the attitude your sister has now, I didn't want them to get the wrong information. And she needs serious psychological help. I understand. Just a little shocking, that's all. Tell me about it. We talked a bit and he got up to leave. So what are you going to do about the shithead? He asked. I don't know. Whatever I do, it'll come back to bite me. I know what I want to do, but, no offense, she's not worth going to jail over. He looked me straight in the eye and said, Don't worry. I'll take care of it. You're still family. It won't come back to haunt you. I won't harm my sister, but he'll get his. That'll even the score. Brother. Tony. Don't do this. I said. Do what? He asked. He turned and left before I could say anything else. So, on Thursday, my wife was served divorce papers at her parents' house. She passed out and they had to take her to the emergency room. She stayed in the hospital for about a week. Then she came back home to her parents' house. Her father came to talk to me. Couldn't we fix this somehow anyway? He asked. Haven't you seen what I've given you? Yes, but obviously she made a mistake. A mistake? I shouted. Scratching a car was a mistake. Forgetting to pay a bill was a mistake. Sleeping with someone else for 17 years, getting pregnant by another man, passing him off as your husband's child, stopping having sex with him wasn't a mistake. I'm just glad the kids were at day camp when I laid into their grandfather. I calmed down and told him to get her to sign the papers. I'm done with her. He wasn't happy with either of us. Tough shit. An interesting thing happened. She was notified about 3.5 weeks ago, and 3 weeks ago the asshole disappeared. He didn't show up for a meeting with his lawyer and his wife. Turns out, for tax purposes, she was the majority owner of Dash Realty. So, she really wasn't concerned and amended her suit to show she was the one leaving him. The divorce process is still ongoing, but now it's going to take a year. Caroline was 2 months pregnant, so we had to wait another 7 months to finalize everything. So we waited. As the case dragged on, her lawyer tried to push for changes to the settlement. She wanted more, claimed she was entitled to more. I proposed letting her keep the house and paying her a 10% settlement. She was to retain her retirement savings in our savings account. No visitations, except for 1 weekend every 2 months at her parents' place. No male or female companions present, let alone Marissa. She didn't want to see her. Her lawyer was against almost everything. I asked my lawyer to set up a meeting. I arrived at my lawyer's office half an hour early and loaded a DVD into his projector. I grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down. She walked in with her lawyer. My lawyer introduced himself and Caroline extended her hand to him. I know who you are. I don't need to meet you. Her lawyer said we should behave civilized and nailed a glance for my best cop. He choked slightly. They began to negotiate. After 4 hours, they had gone through everything but reached no agreement. I vetoed everything and even withdrew a few items. Then she exploded, saying I was being unreasonable. I dropped a hydrogen bomb. Okay, you answer one question truthfully and I'll reconsider. I pressed the play button on the DVD player. The disc started with Caroline and the jerk exiting the Holiday Inn. It was footage from the dashcam of my police car. She had never seen it, never even suspected its existence. Continued until she pulled out the blue lace panties. I stopped it and turned to her. Her face was ashen and her jaw dropped to the table. At the meeting, Caroline, tell me, where are the anniversary panties, my loving wife? Where the hell are they? If you don't sign this as it is, we'll go to court, and everything will become public knowledge. Sign it, she cried, grabbed the pen, and signed everything. Her lawyer was stunned as she grabbed her purse, stood up, and her water broke. She screamed. We called an ambulance and took her to the hospital. I made sure my name wasn't listed as the father on the birth certificate. She gave birth to a boy weighing 3 kilograms. My lawyer filed for DNA testing and voila, he wasn't my child. Furthermore, he wasn't the jerk's child either. She had also cheated on her lover. The divorce went through and I was finally free. I immediately became very popular on the singles market. My daughter told me I was considered a hunk. My son warned me to be careful. Otherwise, you might get attacked. I went to visit my brother-in-law, and we shared a couple of beers. Finally, I asked him if he knew what happened to the jerk. Who's that? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Don't worry about it, I said. I went on some dates, but my heart wasn't in it. About 2 years later, Tony and Teresa threw a party at a bar. Everyone was invited, including my ex-wife. The kids stayed away from her and the guys she brought along. However, her little boy was charming. My daughters literally flocked to him. My now 18-year-old daughter brought a young man to the party. He seemed okay, but he was still being vetted. Actually, I liked him, but don't tell her that. The guy who came with her mother was eyeing my daughter. I saw it, but didn't want to embarrass my daughter with any actions or words. He continued to loom over her, and I was about to intervene when her young man friend joined her. Hey honey, what's going on? He said. Stay out of this, kid. The young lady and I are having a conversation. Oh, don't mind me, he said. I was just trying to keep her from causing you any pain. His hand slid to her thigh, then to her buttock. Get your hands off me, she said, looking him straight in the eye. Hey, you know you like it, don't pretend. She punched him in the throat and grabbed his right hand. His thumb snapped back, cracking, and his scream caught everyone's attention. I don't have my mother's morals, scumbag. Her friend smirked. That's my girl, I thought. Her mother came over, squealing. What have you done? My brother-in-law, who had seen and heard everything, approached and said, "I think both of you should leave." After they left the party, everything quieted down. Then someone new arrived. My sister-in-law rushed over and hugged the striking brunette, about 170 centimeters tall, with a petite chest and legs from hips to ankles. She had the cute face of a neighborhood girl, and her eyes were brown with golden flecks. She was stunning, at least I thought so. My son came over and nudged me in the ribs. "Keep your eyes in your head, old man," he grinned. "What are you talking about?" I asked. Then my sister-in-law brought the lovely lady.